Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. We've got another great show for you tonight. Craig Stocks is here, and he's going to talk about some neat ways to automate various post-processing tasks in PixInsight and Photoshop. But before we get to that, I will talk about just briefly the upcoming calendar. Let me pull that up here. Share that. So next week, we've got Gary M. with us, and he's going to talk about the book he recently published on the VDB catalog. Oh, that should be really interesting. Then we've got some various presenters about special interest groups from astronomy clubs. And then after that, George Helios will be here to talk about the Hocus Focus plugin in Necedah. So I know a lot of folks are eager to see that one. And then we do have some open dates. We've got Tim Martin coming back in early December, but in November, you can see there we've got some open dates. So certainly anyone who has an idea for a talk, we'd certainly love to hear about it, get you on. But also, even if you just happen to know of someone else maybe who maybe you went to a star party and somebody spoke or presented at a local astronomy club or something of that nature. So even if it's just a suggestion, hey, this person did a great talk, you could contact us, send us that information. We could contact them and see about getting them on the program. So let me stop sharing here. And as I mentioned, next week, Gary M. will be with us. And Gary was kind enough to join us tonight. Raced back from a trip just for us. And so, Gary, would you mind telling us just a little bit about what you'll be sharing next week?
Sure, thanks, Patrick. It's been a year since I've talked to this group, and so in that year's time, I've published an update to the compendium and 5 different astrophotography books. So I'll talk just very briefly about all of that, just in case people are interested, but mainly it's going to be talking about the book I recently published, which is the imaging of the entire VDB catalog, 159 objects. So I'll introduce I'll talk to the paper that was published on that, because if you haven't read that, it's really an interesting paper on the VDB catalog, how it was developed, the classification of all the various nebula. And then I'll show a lot of different images that I've included here and talk to that, because really they present some excellent targets. Well, I would say it's a range. A lot of them are excellent targets. A lot of the VDB images are excellent targets. A lot of them are not excellent targets, and so in my book, I rate all of these objects, and we'll show. We might go through all of them. I don't know. We'll see how many we get through. But we'll talk about that, because I think for an astrophotographer, anyway, for those people on the channel here, they're astrophotographers. It's a good place to go for targets that maybe you're not that familiar with. We're always looking for new targets to image, and I think that may give you some ideas of some targets which perhaps you haven't either seen before or imaged. And I actually enjoyed all of the imaging I did, although some of them get a bit tedious. But we'll go through that, and we'll I think have a good time talking about the different targets and how to image them. Patrick?
Cool, that sounds great. So, and that catalog, I actually wasn't all that familiar with it until somewhat recently, but I looked at some images and some of the targets, and of course some of them I was familiar with the targets, but I didn't realize they were in that catalog. But there definitely, as you said, some really neat ones, but there looked like there would be some that would be kind of tough too. So it'll be nice to have that resource to help focus on those ones that maybe going to be a little more fruitful with the time there. So
yeah, stay away from the ones that are rated 0 or 1. Trust me on that. Yeah.
All right, great. I will be looking forward to that next week then, Gary.
Great.
So that then brings us to tonight's presentation by Craig Stocks. And Craig's been on the program a number of times, and certainly he's one of our favorite guests here on the Astro Imaging channel. And every time Craig's on the show, I always learn something useful that I didn't know before. And I'm sure tonight will be no different. So tonight he's going to talk about some ways to automate and speed up some post-processing tasks. So Craig, you can jump in and I'll jump away.
Okay, let me start presenting. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, I will jump on in then. As you said, I'm going to talk about ways to kind of streamline your workflow. I don't know how much of it really speeds it up versus just kind of simplifies it. And none of it is really that high tech or earth shattering. It's a lot of simple stuff that I think anybody can do. And sometimes we just don't think about it. So we operate Utah Desert Remote Observatories. It's a family business with wife, son, daughter, son-in-law, even the grandsons pitch in occasionally. So I wind up imaging remotely, but I think what I'm going to talk about will apply to anybody, whether you're imaging remotely or using an ASI Air. We all have the same tasks that we have to do in terms of, in broad terms, file management, moving files around, in PixInsight, ways to streamline that workflow, and then some in Photoshop. And I'll also mention Lightroom as a really a great tool for finishing your images. As I mentioned, I image remotely. So in my system architecture, I'm using Google Remote Desktop on my home computer to connect to a remote computer. And then Voyager is communicating with all the various pieces on that remote computer to run the telescope. But the thrust of that is the images that I capture wind up living on that remote PC. So the first challenge is getting them from the remote computer to my home computer. And I do that very simply using Dropbox. So I have a shared folder on the remote computer that's also shared on my home computer. So as the images are created, they're automatically transferred, usually within about 10 or 15 seconds, they'll show up on my home computer. So that all takes place automatically overnight. But that could also be something I say you could be using this in your backyard just as easily. I end up then with a folder that typically I'm running 3 systems. So each one of those systems would have a folder that needs copied from Dropbox into its kind of its permanent location on my computer. I do that with a Windows batch file. Windows batch files go back all the way to the early days of DOS as a way to automate DOS commands that you would type into the keyboard. They're all still available, the old commands plus a lot of new commands. But a batch file was just simply, you could call it a script, you could call it just a sequence of commands that could be typed into a terminal. And then you save it as a file with a .bat extension. And then you can execute that batch file from Windows just by double clicking on it in the File Explorer. I'm Windows-based. As I understand it, there are comparable scripting tools on a Mac that could be used just as easily. But my examples are going to be Windows-based because that's what I use. So the example here is to copy last night's files from Dropbox to its permanent home on my D drive. This is the whole script right here. X copy from, to, and then a whole bunch of switches. And then I put a pause command as the second line so that rather than just closing the window, it pauses and lets me see that, yep, it executed and it copied 27 files or whatever the number is. So that's just there for my own peace of mind, but it's not strictly needed. All you really need is this one line. And to create that batch file, you can just simply type it into Windows Notepad or any plain text editor, and then save it as whatever file name you want, .bat. So for instance, copy Dropbox to D drive .bat. And to do that in Windows Notepad, you can just type it into Windows Notepad, and then when you save it, there's 1 or 2 tricks there. First of all, you have to add the .bat to the file name. So you would have to name it copy Nook1 Dropbox.bat. And then secondly, there's a drop down for save as file type that defaults to a .txt. And if you leave it there, it'll automatically add a .txt rather than your .bat, and then it won't work as a batch file. So you have to change the save as file type to all files, and that will save the file copy Nook1 Dropbox.bat. And just to break down the content of that, it's really quite simple. Xcopy is a command that is available from the Windows terminal. It's like a copy command on steroids because it has a lot of other features and switches and options that you can add. But it's just, the format is copy from to. So the command is Xcopy. From is the C users Craig Dropbox, Nook1 Dropbox data /star.star. So that says copy everything in that Dropbox folder and copy it to the :\Astro Nook1 data. And then these various switches tell it to copy only new and changed files, which is typically the case, but it can do a comparison between what's there in the source and what's in the destination, and only copy files that are new or changed since what was on there before. So it actually can be used as a backup. And also switches also tell it to copy all folders and subfolders so that it copies everything in the path starting with Dropbox data. So if you have subfolders and then subfolders by date, for instance, it copies all of that over. And then the next step is to create desktop shortcuts. So on my desktop, I have a few shortcuts arrayed over on the right-hand side that copy each one of those drop boxes. And to create that shortcut, with a shortcut, you can just double click on the icon and it executes the batch file. It kind of confirms the files are copied, and then I will actually go look to make sure they're all there, and then delete the files from the Dropbox folder so it's ready for the next night. That could be automated. I could have it, check for an error code when it finishes and delete the source files. Maybe I'm not a control freak, but I'm kind of a control enthusiast. I like to double check that everything got copied over before I delete the source files. So I do that manually.
Craig, before you go on, I have no experience writing a batch file. If I type Xcopy, and where do I find what the switches are available, and how do I find that? Is it going to pop up on it or what?
It doesn't. I do it in, are you on Windows?
Yes.
Okay. I do it with Notepad, and
okay. But you apparently know what /D/S/E.
Yeah, you can look those up online if you look for the Xcopy options, or you can just copy what I have here.
Yeah, if I Google Xcopy, it's going to pop up with an explanation of all my choices and how to use it. That's probably true. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the /S is the one that in particular tells it to copy all folders and subfolders, so it doesn't copy just the parent folder.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the D is this. I use the same command for daily backups, and so it's only copying files that are new or changed, so it's not copying everything on my hard drive, just the 3 or 4 new files. So some of these are probably extraneous, but they don't hurt anything if you just include the DSECYIH.
And San asked, do you have a Git repo for this? What does that mean?
I do not.
Okay, what does that mean? Git repo.
It's a repository for codes,
I see.
segments and programs.
Okay, Jeff has a suggestion for us to how to find what the commands are.
So, I mean, I could send you this text and you could include it in the text for the YouTube.
Thank you. I don't want to delay you too much here.
So,
thank you.
And I'll be talking later about how to create a shortcut.
Okay.
So, you know, in very short order, that gets me the files copied from the Dropbox to the permanent location on the D drive, and I'm ready for PixInsight. So I start PixInsight by just double-clicking, well, double-click on the X copy, confirm the files are copied. We already did that. Now that we're in PixInsight, you'll notice that I have a lot of process icons and lined up over on the right-hand side. And everybody will have a little bit different workflow that they like. So your icons would probably look different than mine. So I don't necessarily want to tell you, you know, you should use my icons. What I want to do is show you how to create the icons. They're arranged so that I can work from top to bottom. So I start, just for convenience, I've got a shortcut to the screen transfer function that I use a lot, channel combination, gradient removal tools, blur exterminator, spectrophotometric color calibration, another set of blur exterminators, histogram transformation to actually do the stretch, and then some process icons to apply noise exterminator and star exterminator. So to create one of those process icons, let's take an example of creating one for Graxpert. So first you would open the process or the script that you want to create the shortcut for. So in the case of Graxpert, you would go to Toolbox, Script, Toolbox, Graxpert, and that would open the dialog where you can set whatever, you know, whatever options you want for Graxpert, smoothing, and so forth. I've got smoothing, subtraction, replace the target view, and then you simply drag the triangle out here to create a new instance or a new process icon representing that function or that process and all of the options that you had set at the time you created a copy. And then you just set the icon identifier, right click on the icon or that process icon you just created, choose set icon identifier, and then you just drag it over to the right-hand side or wherever you want to save it on your desktop. I usually just have them saved in a line on the right-hand side. And now we want to save all these icons that we've created, or if we update something, we want to save it again. And I do that by creating a blank project that only has the icons in it. And so you go to File, Save Project, and you'll get this dialog where you have a whole host of options and features. The main one to have checked is Include Icons, and you probably do not want to have checked the Include Images because it will, if you have any images open on the workspace at the time, it will save those along with the icons, and really all you need is the icons. And so I have this saved just as a blank project with process icons. That's the name of the project that I just saved. Now, a really fun trick, the operating system knows that those PixInsight project files are associated with PixInsight. So just like you can launch a Microsoft Word by clicking on a Word document or double clicking on a Word document, or double click on a picture and it'll open your picture editor, you can double click on your project file and it knows it needs to load PixInsight in order to load that project file. So the next step then is to create a shortcut to that blank project file so you can launch PixInsight and your blank project with just one double click. And the way you do that is in Windows, you would right click and choose New, Create Shortcut, and ask what item do you want to create a shortcut for. And then you just click Browse and you navigate to, in my case, it was to the Documents folder, PixInsight, and within PixInsight, there's a blank project with process icons folder. It's got a different kind of a icon. So you're tempted to think that's the thing that you create the shortcut to, but it's actually, you need to open that folder, and the project itself is inside that folder. So it's this project that you actually create the shortcut to. And then when you save that on your desktop, now you just double click on this PixInsight process icon, and it launches PixInsight in your blank project, and you're ready to go to work. Once you're in PixInsight, typically one of the next things you're going to want to do is run the weighted batch preprocessor. One of the really nice tools that they've included with it is the ability to load an entire directory at once. And I use that probably 80% of the time when I'm loading something. It lets you load lights from multiple nights as long as they're in the same folder. So if you have a folder for Orion and then one for, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you can just load the Orion folder, and it will load all the lights and all nights as it, traverses down the folder structure looking for data that it knows how to load. You can also use it to load all of your calibration masters at once. So I typically will do the plus directory twice, once to load all of the lights from all of the nights, and then second to load all of the calibration masters. And to do that, I create a folder that has a set of calibration masters for each system combination. Since I've got multiple scopes and both color and monochrome cameras that I move around from system to system. So for instance, this folder has the flats and the dark and bias frames for the plane wave system with the color camera. Here's the plane wave with mono camera. The same way with the Rokinon, Takahashi. Here's the Takahashi with one-shot color. Here's the Takahashi with mono. Here's the Takahashi with the second mono camera. So I've got different combinations. I just choose whichever folder I'm working with, and it loads the flat, darks, and bias frames all in one fell swoop. So this is what my master calibration folder looks like for one of them. The way I create these is if I'm running new flats, I'll create the flats and then just pull the masters out of the masters folder that PixInsight creates and consolidate them into this calibration master folder. Now that we've got things loaded into PixInsight, we've run WBPP and we've loaded our masters. Now becomes the tedious process of doing the initial processing. And typically I would use something like Graxpert to remove gradients, and it adds a nice level of local contrast. I might run Blur Exterminator in correct only mode. I might run Blur Exterminator in its full mode and so forth. So, that's a lot of clicking and dragging. And the way to simplify that is to use an image container to batch up the process. So to do that, you right-click on the background in PixInsight and choose Image Container. You can also use the shortcut with Windows. It'd be Control-Alt-I, so it'd be Command-Option-I, I think, on a Mac. That will bring up this image container window or dialog. And to load the views, there's some icons on the right-hand side. This is to load files into the list if you're wanting to operate on files. Normally you're operating, or at least I'm normally operating on views, so I would use this plus views. And when you hover it over it, the tooltip tells you this is for plus views, or to add views. When you click on that, it opens this select views, and typically you can just select all and click OK to add these 4 views to the list in the image container. You can double click on individual lines to select or deselect either here or within the image container dialog. Now that you've got an image container, I can just drag the triangle from this image container window up to, for instance, Graxpert, and it will run Graxpert on each one of these images without stopping to ask me questions. And I can go get a cup of coffee or check my email or take a short nap while that's working. One caveat, it works great with kind of standalone tools that don't require any interaction. So that would be something like the gradient correction or Graxpert, any of the Russell Croman, like Blur Exterminator, Star Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, those all run great. Tools like dynamic background extraction require an interaction, that it actually does some pre-processing when you open it on an individual view. And so it actually has to be closed and opened individually onto each image. And you can't use it from a image container like this. And that is, in fact, one reason I've been migrating away from dynamic background extraction and more towards Graxpert or gradient correction, because I can run them from my image container. And just, to me, it just makes my life simpler. Now that we have an image container, we can take it another step and have process containers. And just like an image container contains multiple images, and I can drag the triangle onto a process container, here I have a process container that contains two processes. It runs Noise Exterminator and then Star Exterminator with the setting to save the stars. And to create that, I would go to all processes in order to find it, and then process container. And you get a somewhat similar looking dialog, but for creating a process container. And basically all you have to do is drag the individual instances of, in this case, Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator into the process container. And then once you've done that, use the triangle to drag out a new instance. And just like you did before, give it a new name and save it in your stack, and then save your blank project with process icons to have the updated icons on the right. So now, you're running four images through two different processes. So that's 8 discrete steps, all done with one click and drag. And, that'll run for a couple minutes, and again, gives you time for an even longer nap. So any questions on that before I forge ahead into some of the Photoshop stuff?
There's no questions. There is a comment from Jeff that says, wow, this is a fantastic presentation.
Oh, he must be watching something different. So if any questions pop up, let me know.
Okay.
So, I do a lot of work in Photoshop. I use PixInsight primarily to create the input files that I'm going to then process in Photoshop. So my workflow tends to be pretty Photoshop heavy. You could use, there's other programs like Photoshop if you don't like Adobe or don't like Photoshop, or if you're happy with whatever you're using. And I think most of them have a lot of the same tools or the same capabilities. So I happen to use Photoshop. So in PixInsight, I'm generally creating the monochrome starless images as well as a star image. And then in Photoshop, I do the color mapping and create a combined, in this case, SHO image, and then combine that with the stars to create the finished image all in one layer stack in Photoshop. And I may use the term non-destructive. What non-destructive means is that even with a finished image, I can go back to the very first thing I did in Photoshop and change it or tweak it and see how that change or tweak is reflected in the finished image instantaneously. And I don't have to guess, how I need to process something back here in order to predict what the outcome is going to look like. Just a little pitch for non-destructive editing. But with that workflow, you wind up with quite a few layers, and among them are things like the hue saturation layer that's used to apply color. And so I want to be able to get from these input layers, the starless, monochrome, oxygen, hydrogen, and sulfur, to a finished image, pretty painlessly and without a lot of repetitive work. So I like to go from these 4 input files, the SHO plus the stars, to this image in 1 second. So let me show you how to do that. So you start, I always start in Photoshop by loading all of the files as layers. And to do that, you go to load under File, Load Files and Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And what that really means is load individual files as individual layers in one document or one image. So that gets your files in. You'll get this first Load Layers dialog. You click Browse, then you get a Explorer window to go select the files that you want to load. And once you see the files you want in that first Load Layers dialog, then you click OK. And that's what actually loads the files. Once they're loaded, you'll see that you have, in this case, these 4 layers, stars, and then hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur in individual layers. And what we want to get to is individual layer groups, where each layer group has lots of stuff going on in it. So the top layer group is stars, then there's a set of global adjustments, and then the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. And the order doesn't really matter with this workflow. I could have sulfur first and oxygen on the bottom. What helps me, though, is by always using the same order. I don't have to hunt quite so long to find if I'm looking for the sulfur layer or the hydrogen layer. I know where it's going to be. I don't have to read down through the list as carefully because I know it's going to be in the middle or the bottom, depending on what it is. But each one of these layer groups, let me expand this a little bit. So here's the details of what's in that hydrogen layer group. At the bottom of the layer group is the actual data. So this is the hydrogen starless image. And then I have a text layer that just has the HA letters so that I can see what color I'm color mapping the hydrogen. And then I have a blank layer in soft light blending mode for any local density adjustments. In photo terms, that would be called burning and dodging. And then I generally use levels for adjusting the brightness and contrast of the individual layer. And then a hue saturation, and the hue saturation typically for hydrogen and an SHO image is going to be set to a green color. So once I have those loaded, I can create actions. And actions are just recorded steps in Photoshop. Other programs might call them macros, but it's just a recorded set of keystrokes, commands, mouse clicks, moves that you can record and then play back as if you were doing them live from the keyboard and the mouse. And if it's in the toolbar, it's the one that looks like a play button. If it's not visible, then you would go to the, I think it's the view option, and you can enable the actions palette. So in the actions palette, I've created some specific actions, and one of them is the Make Astros layer, and it has the stars, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur. And I've even set a shortcut key of Control F10. So I can press Control F10 to execute this action whenever I want to. This is the record button. So I guess you start with the create action. So if you're going to create a macro, you would click the plus button to create a new action. And then you would click record, just start recording, and go through whatever actions that you're going to want to repeat. And when you're done, click the stop button and it'll stop recording and it'll save the action. And then to play it back, you can just select whatever action you want to play, and then click the play button. Or in button mode, each one of these actions will be a button on its own, and you can just click the button. And they can be simple, 2 or 3 lines, or more complex. You can do a little bit of branching and if type logic, although it's not really designed to do that elegantly. So you're kind of pushing the limits of the tool when you start down that road. But I did do a job for a fellow last year, I guess it was, where we had to process around 1 million images to put them into frames and mats for display on a website. And I did all that with actions. So if you're creating actions, think ahead and plan, because there are a few hidden gotchas that might surprise you. The first one is it does depend on layer names if you click on a layer. So for instance, if I click on a layer called hydrogen 789, it's going to record that name hydrogen 789 in the macro. And the next time I'm working with a file, I probably won't have that same file name. So instead, you can use the alternate left and right bracket keys to move up and down in layers. So if you need to change your selected layer to one below, use the alternate up and down to navigate down to the layer that you want to work on. Once it's recorded, you can record a simple action, and then you can add to it. You can add at the end, or you can even insert new steps by selecting a step and then clicking the record icon, and it will start recording right after whatever step you had selected. Button mode makes it easier to execute actions. And as I mentioned, you can set shortcut keys such as the Control F10, and you can also set a color, and it'll display that color in button mode that can make it easier to find the action you're looking for. Let's jump into Photoshop. And I have already done the file scripts, load files into stack. So here are the 4 layers that we just talked about: the stars, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. And I've even named my action and make Astro layers stars HOS to remind me that I want hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur as the sequence. And in order to execute that, all I have to do is click on this button. And there are my layers for the stars, global adjustments, hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. There's the finished image, or the semi-finished image. Now it would be time to do the whatever editing I want to do in Photoshop. Each one of these layers has, let me zoom in here, has a text layer. And because that text layer is kind of going along for the ride along with the monochrome data, it's going to take on whatever density and color the whole layer group is taking on. And I can get to each one of these narrowband layers has a text layer. If I want to get to just the text layers, let's say I want to spread them out, they're a little scrunched together because this is a vertical orientation. On the options bars, there's a drop down for kind, and then there's a half dozen different icons, one of them being a T. If I click on the T, that'll select just the text layers that are in the layer stack. So when I click on that, there are the 3: hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. So if I want to, for instance, move the oxygen over a little bit so it's more readable, and then move the sulfur over, and I'm just using the move tool and the keypad to move that. Now they're a little bit more spread out so I can see them better. If I want to turn them off, I can just turn those 3 off. You can click on the eyeball one at a time, or if you click and drag, like if I click and drag, it'll turn all 3 off. Click and drag, it'll turn all 3 on. And then to go back to the normal view, I just click on the T again to unselect that. And now we're back to the original layers. And you'll see if I change, for instance, let's go to the hydrogen, and it's using a hue saturation adjustment layer to set the color to 120, which is a pure green, lightness of -50, and that's, I've concluded that it's reasonably important to be pretty close to right on -50. So I have that built right into the macro, saturation of 100, hue of 120. That colors this layer green. But if I want to change that color, I can just move this hue slider back and forth, and I may want to fine tune it. And as I change it, if you notice, the color of the HA is changing as I move that slider. So it creates a file that's somewhat self-documenting in terms of what color palette you used. And I created this macro just the way I explained. Right now it's in button mode. The drop down will let me change out of button mode. And so this is in list mode. And this is where you have the controls to create a new action, record it, play it back, and so forth. Something else that I think is a real time saver in Photoshop is using smart objects. A smart object encapsulates whatever you put into that smart object. And a smart object could be one layer, it could be 2 layers, it could be 5 layers and 7 adjustment layers. It's whatever you want to encapsulate and then treat as one layer. And you can basically treat it just like you would any other basic layer. But it has one superpower, and that is that you can apply non-destructive smart filters. Smart filters are kind of a key element of non-destructive editing because it lets you do things that are fairly sophisticated without having to make copies and do a stamp visible. Everything remains completely editable. And you can also nest smart objects. So you can convert a smart object into a smart object to add additional filters. So just to show how that might work, I'm going to start by clicking on the text button to select just the text layers. And I'm going to turn off the text. And let's say we want to add more contrast to the, let's say to the hydrogen. So I'm going to go to the hydrogen, and one way to add contrast is with a, well, let's sharpen it first. Let's do it simple. So I want to do some sharpening on this layer. And normally you would use something like filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. And smart sharpen doesn't have anything to do with it being a smart object. That's just the name of that filter. But that applies the effect destructively. It actually changes the pixels, and we don't want to do that. So instead, I'm going to right click here to the right of the layer name, and I'm going to choose Convert to Smart Object. And now you'll see there's a little badge right here on the icon, and that indicates that this is a smart filter or smart object. Now I can add a smart filter by going to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and it brings up the dialog box where I can set the sharpening settings. And let's just crank it way up crazy high. Click OK. And we've now applied a smart filter in a not very smart way. But because it's a smart filter, I can change it. I can just double click on the word Smart Sharpen. That brings our dialog back up with the settings that we had. And I can dial these back down to a more modest set. Click OK. And that looks better. I might want to add some local contrast to this, but I want to do it non-destructively. So I'm going to convert this smart object into another smart object and just encapsulate this into a second one. Now I can go to Filter, Other, High Pass, And this is kind of an old school way of adding local contrast. Click OK, but this has to be applied in soft light blending mode. Normally you would do that on the layer itself using the blending options. But since this is a smart filter, we have over here on the very right-hand side, we have this icon. If I double click on that, that brings up the dialog for this smart filter, and I can change it from normal to soft light blending mode. And now we've applied a high pass filter non-destructively as a smart filter. And that has two or three big advantages. We might decide that it's too strong in some areas, so we have a mask where we can mask it. Because it's a smart filter, I can now come back to the smart filter and play with this radius to decide if, exactly what looked best. So I'm playing with this local contrast while I'm looking at the result of the complete finished image and judging how it's going to affect the finished image. Very powerful. If I get to this point and I realize there was a satellite trail I forgot to take out of the original image, I can double click on the smart object, and that opens the smart object that we nested into it. Click on the smart object, double click on the smart object again. And now we can come in with the healing brush, do whatever repairs we need to do. And then I simply close this. Let me do something so it thinks I changed it. It'll ask me, do I want to save the changes? I'll say yes. And it updates this file into this smart object and applies this smart filter. Save, yes. And so whatever changes we just made in that source, taking out the satellite trail, for instance, is now immediately reflected in the finished image with all of the other work done. This is also a handy way if I photograph this same target the next night, I can just use the same document and replace this smart object contents with the new data from the next night. So got kind of deep into smart objects, but they are extremely powerful. Last thing I'll mention is digital asset management. I never flatten a Photoshop master file. I save it as a .psb, as a large format document, and that saves all of the layers and layer settings and smart filters and everything so that I can come back tomorrow and continue to make changes. And then I use Lightroom, which is included with Photoshop, to make any final edits, crops, and to export the final JPEGs that I'm going to post online. So like I say, it's included with Photoshop. It lets you keep track of your images. It creates nice little thumbnails so you can see what you've got. I can just double click on any one of these, go into develop mode, and apply basically the equivalent of what the camera raw filter is, all built into Lightroom. And again, all non-destructive. I'll do final edits and cropping, and then export as JPEGs. If I see something that I want to go back to Photoshop, I can just choose to edit this image in Photoshop. It opens the original in Photoshop, make the changes. When I save and close from Photoshop, it updates the view here with all of the Lightroom edits still intact. So you can round trip to Photoshop very easily. Just kind of a bonus tip, I use a Synology NAS, network attached storage, for backup and also overflow. So eventually all the images get moved onto the NAS, along with all the other images. In fact, it's a key part of my backup strategy, but I have other backups as well. But I do have to periodically clean old files off my hard drive because it fills up very quickly. So maybe once a month, I'll clean files off of my hard drive, but I know they're still resident on the NAS, and Lightroom keeps a record with a thumbnail of everything that I ever had in it. So I can quickly go back, find something in Lightroom, and if I need to retrieve it from the NAS, I know the exact file name that I need to go retrieve. So that's a lot of information. Any questions?
I had a question. I don't think there were any in the comments section. Folks, remember to go ahead and add any comments you want or any questions you have over in the comment sections, and then we'll pass them on to Craig. But my question was, I noticed several points you were using JPEGs as the masters for your layers.
Yeah, that was just as an expedient for the demonstration. Okay. Normally those are 16-bit TIFFs.
Okay.
But 16-bit TIFFs get a little big and slow.
Craig?
Yeah.
I assume you have a subscription to Photoshop?
Yes, the photographer's bundle, which is, if you pay by the year, is $10 a month. That includes Photoshop, both versions of Lightroom. I'm using Lightroom Classic, but there's also they call it just plain Lightroom, which is a little bit more online based, although the files can still just happily live on your computer. But it's not quite as mature as Lightroom Classic.
So that's always a question. Do we want to pay Adobe month after month for the privilege of using your software? And even though some of the functions you describe are only in the latest version, those of us, actually not me, but others that had older versions of Photoshop, most of the things you can still do.
Yeah, I think pretty much everything I went over here, you can probably do clear back to CS2, maybe even before that. Most of this stuff has been around for a long time. The only tool I use that's really new that I use a lot is the remove tool, which is very nice for as an alternative to the healing brush, which is a good alternative to the clone stamp. But
yeah, and some of the new AI features that are coming along.
Yeah, those are, I don't use those very much, but yeah, those are available in the newer versions. Personally, I used Photoshop back in the days when it was $600 and some to buy, and then you would spend $200 or $300 a year to upgrade both Photoshop and Lightroom on their annual or 18-month update cycle. I'm a big fan of the $10 a month. It's cheaper than what I used to spend. It gets you world-class, industry standard software for the price of a cappuccino. And it lowers the cost of entry. You don't have to come up with $200 or $300 to get started. So I know Adobe gets a lot of bad rap for the subscription model, and I understand people don't like it. I don't like it, but I do see a lot of advantages, and I've been happily using it for since they came out with it, and they still have not increased the price.
So my question is, cappuccinos cost $10?
That's what I sell them for.
Gary, you want to turn yourself on and ask your question?
Sure. I wasn't, I was about to, oops, sorry. I was about to put my pajamas on, so I won't do that yet.
Well, if you're going to do that, turn your camera off, Gary.
So Craig, I'm really intrigued by your mention of Lightroom, because that's something I don't hear a lot of, but I use that as a lot, really, as final touch-up. And I'm just curious, as you kind of touched on it, but you didn't say much about how you use it. In particular, I find the masking capability in Lightroom to be incredible. You can create luminous masks so easily. You can create any mask just with a click of a button and sharpen certain parts of the image or reduce saturation. It's really much easier than any other tool I've found for masking. And also some of the other tools, such as contrast control and noise reduction. It's just convenient to do that at the very end of the process, because it's so, I think this Lightroom's got some very powerful tools in it that I think are underutilized by many imagers.
Yeah, I agree. Photoshop, and especially Lightroom, they're designed to, help you enhance pictures, photographs. And by the time you get to this point, you've transitioned from linear data and astronomical images into a photograph. And so tools like Lightroom and Photoshop are really optimized for making photographs look good. And that's the way I use Lightroom, kind of the way you described, is the final crop, local contrast enhancement, brightness, tweaking colors, local colors. There's a lot of things that are very easy to do with the Lightroom interface. So I get it, 90% of the way there in Photoshop and then finish it in Lightroom.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's a feeling in astrophotography is you can do everything with PixInsight and you don't need to do anything else. And Photoshop is, kind of old fashioned where you're manipulating pixels. I disagree with that completely. As I say, these are tools, not rules. And
Yep.
if you're not using Photoshop, not that everyone has to, but if you're not, you're missing out on some opportunity to improve your images where you can use layers, smart filters, non-destructive changes, which you simply can't do in PixInsight. PixInsight has its unequivocal functions that you can't do in Photoshop.
Yep.
And Photoshop has its as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eric, if I could answer Craig just for a second, because I think Eric's got a great point, and I use all three. I think the issue is that in order to do what you're saying, Eric, and which is what I do, and I think what Craig does, which is use all of those programs to kind of their best applications, you really have to spend a lot of time with them. And I think some people, especially if you're working, you have a family, you're not just an old retired guy like I am, you just don't have the time to invest. And it gets to be very frustrating. I'm not going to mention names, but I've talked to 2 people in the last month that either are about to or have given up on PixInsight because it's a difficult program to learn how to use. So I feel like I'm lucky. I have the luxury of having spent, thousands of hours with these programs, but not everybody has that luxury.
Well, let me just add to that. PixInsight has a high learning curve, but once you understand it, I don't want to say it's simple, but it's routine. Photoshop is the same way. I mean, you can look at Photoshop and scratch your head and have no idea what to do. I've used Photoshop since version 1, 30 years now, 29 years. So it seems simple, but there's a learning curve in Photoshop, which is just as steep as any other program.
Yeah, and I don't know if Photoshop is necessarily any easier or harder to learn than PixInsight. But if you don't know either one, I would propose that you'd be well off to learn PixInsight for the things it does well and Photoshop for the things it does well. There are people who get beautiful results out of PixInsight. Wouldn't say that you can't do it. The rhetorical question I always ask is, would you use PixInsight to edit your vacation photos? And the answer is usually no.
And you can't transpose someone that is winked during the family photograph with 16 people.
Yeah.
In PixInsight. At least I don't know how to do that.
You probably can, but it would I'm guessing it would be painful.
So, Craig, I had a question for you about the when you were talking about creating actions and you were referring to not clicking on layers because then it sort of takes the name and using the bracket keys instead. So,
yeah.
Can you just clarify a little bit what you were getting at there? I guess if you'd use the bracket keys, then it just name agnostic then as far as the layer itself goes. Is that
correct? So let's say if I were recording a macro and the current selected layer is the this hue saturation. So if I'm here and I want to select this bottom layer, if I click on it, that's going to embed that name into the macro. So instead, if I think it's alternate and left bracket, that moves the selected layer down. So now whatever I execute, it's the macro's recording, go down 4 layers and then do this next step.
I see. So that way, and of course, the way you've got it set up, it's always going to put the same, that you've got the hydrogen and the oxygen, et cetera, all in the same order every time. But this way, it'll continue to run then without worrying. Otherwise, if that layer is not called elephant trunk, it's called something else, then I would imagine the action will just error out, right?
It just stops and says, oh, there is no elephant trunk layer. but there is one 4 down. And you're right, the way I have it set up, the action depends on starting out with the layers in that order.
All right, great, thank you. That's helpful. So, do we have any other questions online? I think we got them all.
I think we got. I'd like to say something before we leave, though, Patrick, if I might. Before we started the show, Craig said that it was going to be a show where we probably knew everything that he was going to say. And okay, I'll dispute that. But the reason we were talking about that was because we were talking about getting other presenters for the show. And one of the reasons that people tell us that they don't particularly want to be on the Astro Imaging channel is because they don't think they've got anything to say or anything that's new. And I told Craig then, and I'm telling you all now, that, yeah, we've done 500 shows. So yeah, something's been done probably. And yet Craig just came up with a bunch of stuff that I would bet you that 50% of you guys didn't know everything about that. And, you know, there are plenty of you people out there that could really do a pretty interesting show sharing some stuff. And you may think that everybody already knows what you know, but you might be wrong. And even if you are going to talk about some stuff that we already know, you might be able to present it in a way that it'll finally get through to some people. So we need people. So hit the contact button and volunteer yourself as a presenter on the Astro Imaging channel. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Patrick.
Craig, you can stop presenting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks for making that point, Alex. And of course, as we were talking about before the show, Craig, you're always so modest, but you know, you said, "Oh, I'm sure everybody knows everything I'm going to talk about." Well, I definitely didn't. So I know I picked up a number of useful tidbits right out of the gate. So, and not the least of which is to create that PixInsight project, because I always do the exact same thing. Open up PixInsight, load my standard process icons. I'm wasting all that time. Now I'm going to set it up just like you have it. Double click on one icon and there it is. So yay. An X copy, never heard of that, but
Yes.
that seems real useful because copying files is something that I do all the time and it's very tedious. So very helpful.
And Craig, you can stay with us once we
Yep.
end the show if you'd like.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for coming back on. And next week,
My pleasure.
we'll be looking forward to Gary's talk. And for now, that's it. So, Jaime, you can take us out. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
See
Good night.
you
Good
next
night,
week.
Night.
everyone.